I didn't just bark orders at an Alpha King. I threw my car keys at his chest, shoved a $50 bill into his coveralls, and demanded he fix my transmission. I had a career-defining corporate pitch in 20 minutes, and I refused to let a stalled engine ruin it. Instead of kicking me out of his pristine private garage, the towering stranger caught my keys with impossible reflexes. His amber eyes flared with dark, predatory amusement. He didn't fix my car. He simply pulled my crumpled cash from his pocket, pressed a button on the wall, and the heavy steel bay doors slammed shut, locking us inside. "You're not leaving," he rumbled, stepping toward me.
Welcome back to Tiana's Romance Collections. Before we dive into today's story, I have to say a massive thank you. We officially just hit our 1,000 subscriber milestone. I am so incredibly grateful for every single one of you who has joined the pack. To celebrate, I want to see how far our community reaches. Head down to the comments right now and drop your city or country. Let me know where in the world you're tuning in from today. And if you want to elevate your listening experience, hit that join button below the video to join the membership perk. Channel members unlock exclusive early access to new stories before they go public. Plus, you get custom loyalty badges that make your name stand out right there in the comments. Thank you again for an amazing 1K. Grab your headphones, get comfortable, and let's get into the story.
Chapter 1. I didn't just trespass into a billionaire's private sanctuary. I threw my heavy brass keychain directly at his chest, shoved a crumpled $50 bill into the pocket of his grease-stained coveralls, and ordered him to fix my transmission. 20 minutes, I snapped, adjusting the collar of my blazer as a drop of nervous sweat rolled down my spine. If this rusted bucket isn't running by then, I'll make sure your manager fires you. The man didn't flinch. He caught the keys midair with reflexes that defied human physics. He towered over me, broad-shouldered and dangerously still, his eyes flashing a vivid, impossible amber. He looked down at the cash, then back at me. "You're not leaving." I scoffed, tapping my heel rapidly against the polished concrete. "I am leaving, actually. At exactly 1:45. I have a boardroom pitch that dictates whether I make senior partner or spend the next 5 years designing strip malls. So unless you want to be personally responsible for the death of modern architecture, pop the hood." He didn't move toward my sputtering vintage coupe. He didn't even look at it. Instead, he slowly pulled the $50 bill from his pocket, smoothing out the wrinkles with maddening deliberation. The garage around us was too quiet, too pristine. Now that the blinding adrenaline of my car breaking down in the middle of downtown was fading, I started to actually notice my surroundings. There were no stray tools scattered on the floor, no calendar of half-dressed models pinned to a dirty wall, just millions of dollars worth of flawless, custom-built hypercars parked in absolute terrifying symmetry beneath rows of surgical-grade LED lighting. And the mechanic? He didn't look like he belonged under a chassis. His jaw was carved from granite, and the way he carried himself, utterly relaxed but completely commanding, made the air in the room feel suspiciously thin. "My manager," he repeated, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that vibrated right through the soles of my shoes. A slow, predatory smirk curved his lips. "That's a new one. Are you going to fix it or not?" I crossed my arms, refusing to let him see the sudden spike of panic in my chest. I never backed down. Not in the cutthroat corporate boardroom, and certainly not in a downtown garage. "No," he said simply. "Excuse me? I'm not fixing your car." He took a single, deliberate step toward me. The sheer size of him was overwhelming, casting a shadow that swallowed me whole. But I stood my ground, locking my knees and lifting my chin to maintain direct eye contact. "In fact, I don't think you're going to that pitch at all." "You do not dictate my schedule," I fired back, my voice sharp and unapologetic. "Give me my keys. I'll find a competent shop down the block." I held out my hand, expecting him to drop the keyring into my palm. Instead, he just stared at me, that amber gaze sharpening into something ancient and intensely focused. The silence stretched, heavy and thick with an unspoken challenge. I could see the amusement dancing in his eyes. He was enjoying this. He was enjoying me. Fascinating, he murmured, almost to himself, tilting his head as if studying a particularly aggressive species of bird. You have absolutely no idea what you just walked into, do you? I walked into an inconvenience, I snapped, dropping my hand when it became clear he wasn't returning my property. Look, if 50 isn't enough, name your rush fee. I have a blank check policy for incompetence today. He chuckled, a dark, rich sound that echoed off the high ceilings and sent a totally involuntary shiver down my spine. You don't give orders here, little architect. Before I could unleash the ruthless corporate tirade currently building in my throat, he reached to the side and pressed a small, unmarked button on the wall. A heavy, mechanical groan echoed through the massive space. I spun around just in time to watch the reinforced steel bay doors slide downward, slamming into the concrete floor with a deafening thud. The heavy industrial deadbolts engaged with a resounding, undeniable clack. Total silence descended like a suffocating blanket. I whipped back around to face him, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. The exit was sealed. What did you just do? I accepted your bribe, he said smoothly, tossing my keys onto a spotless titanium workbench behind him. $50 buys my time, and right now I have decided to spend it entirely on you. Chapter 2. I stared at the impenetrable wall of corrugated steel that had just slammed shut, sealing me off from the outside world. The heavy thud of the deadbolts locking into place echoed through the massive, sterile garage, settling deep in my bones. For a split second, my meticulously structured reality fractured. I was an architect. I designed spaces for optimal flow, safety, and function. I did not design cages, and I certainly did not intend to be trapped in one by a mechanic who looked like he could bench press a commercial dump truck. I whipped around to face him. He was leaning casually against a gleaming titanium workbench, his massive arms crossed over his chest. He looked entirely too comfortable. "Open that door," I ordered. My voice was a shade higher than my usual courtroom-ready pitch, but I held my ground. Right now, I am not playing games. I have to be at a boardroom table in 14 minutes. You aren't going anywhere, he replied, his tone as smooth as aged whiskey. You stormed into my private sanctuary, threw heavy metal at my chest, and attempted to hire me like a common laborer. You owe me an apology, little architect. I owe you $50, which you already pocketed, I snapped, pulling my phone from my blazer pocket. I tapped the screen aggressively. And I don't apologize for expecting competence. Now open the bay doors, or I am calling building security, then I'm calling the police. He let out a low, rumbling laugh that vibrated against the polished concrete. It wasn't a cruel sound, but it was dripping with absolute, unapologetic arrogance. Go ahead. Call building management. They will tell you that Croft Industries owns the title to this block. Call the police. The commissioner plays golf with my chief of staff. The only authority in this room, sweetheart, is me. My thumb hovered over the keypad. Croft. The name rang a distant, terrifying bell in the back of my mind. Gideon Croft, the billionaire industrialist who had seemingly bought half the city's real estate overnight. I lowered the phone, my mind racing through the variables of this absolute disaster. So, what is the plan here, Mr. Croft? I asked, refusing to let him see the tremor in my hands. I lifted my chin, meeting his impossible amber eyes head-on. You hold me hostage until I miss my pitch? You ruin my career over a bruised ego? His gaze sharpened, locking onto mine with an intensity that made the breath catch in my throat. He pushed off the workbench and closed the distance between us in 3 long, silent strides. I forced myself not to take a step back. When he stopped, he was so close I could smell the faint scent of expensive motor oil and crisp, clean cedar. My ego is perfectly intact, he murmured, looking down at me as if I were the most fascinating puzzle he had ever encountered. What I am doing is negotiating. You want to get to your pitch. I want to see how far you are willing to push that absurd, beautiful defiance of yours. So we make a deal. I don't make deals with hostage takers. You will make this one. He reached out, his large fingers lightly tracing the lapel of my blazer. The touch was completely casual, yet it carried an electric weight that made my pulse completely erratic. I will hit that button. I will personally drive you to your high-rise, ensuring you walk through those boardroom doors with a minute to spare. In exchange, you give me your Friday evening. I blinked, completely thrown off balance. You're kidnapping me to extort a dinner date? I am securing an investment, he corrected, a wicked smirk crossing his face. Yes or no, Delaney? My breath hitched. I hadn't told him my name. I glanced at the digital clock on the wall. 12 minutes to the pitch. My entire career was riding on this presentation. I looked back at the towering billionaire, recognizing the immovable dominance in his posture. He wouldn't yield. Fine, I gritted out, stepping out of his personal space. Friday, dinner. Now open the damn door. His smirk widened into a triumphant grin. He reached behind him and slammed his palm against a green button. The heavy steel doors groaned and began to rise, letting the chaotic noise of the city flood back in. Excellent, he said, turning on his heel. He didn't walk toward my broken-down coupe. He walked straight past it, pulling a sleek black key fob from his coveralls. Let's go. Chapter 3. The car he led me toward wasn't just a vehicle. It was an act of financial violence. It was a matte black, custom-built hypercar that looked less like it belonged on a road and more like it belonged in a classified military hangar. The doors lifted upward in a smooth, silent glide like the wings of a predatory bird. Get in, Gideon commanded, tossing my $50 bill onto the dashboard. I didn't hesitate. Desperation overrode my absolute refusal to let him dictate my actions. I slid into the passenger seat, my practical skirt riding up slightly as I sank into the ridiculously soft, hand-stitched leather. The cabin was intimate, perfectly engineered, and completely terrifying. When Gideon folded his massive frame into the driver's seat, the space instantly felt claustrophobic. He didn't bother with a seatbelt. He pressed a button on the center console, and the engine roared to life with a concussive sound that rattled my teeth. Before the passenger door even fully locked, he threw it into gear and launched us out of the garage. You are going to get us killed, I gasped, gripping the door handle as the G-force pinned me back against the seat. We shot into downtown traffic, weaving between delivery trucks and sedans with impossible, terrifying precision. I have never crashed in my life, Gideon replied calmly. He didn't even look stressed. He was steering a $3 million machine through rush hour with one hand resting casually on the wheel. You said you had 14 minutes. I am providing a service. You should be thanking me. I would rather walk, I snapped, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. And I don't thank people for fixing a problem they intentionally caused. He laughed, a rich, deep sound that filled the small cabin. You are relentless. Most people in my presence spend their time trying to figure out what I want to hear. You just say exactly what you think. Because I don't care who you are, I said sharply. You're just the guy standing between me and my senior partnership. We will see about that, he murmured. He hit the accelerator, and the hypercar surged forward, blowing past a yellow light with inches to spare. Despite my absolute fury, I couldn't help but steal a glance at him. He was completely in his element. The chaotic, aggressive environment of the city streets didn't faze him in the slightest. He navigated the danger with an effortless authority, projecting an aura of dominance that was both deeply infuriating and entirely magnetic. He wasn't just rich. There was an apex predator stillness to him that commanded the space around him. He took the final corner hard, the tires gripping the asphalt with a sharp screech, and slammed on the brakes directly in front of the soaring glass facade of my corporate headquarters. We stopped perfectly within the red no parking zone. 8 minutes to spare, he announced, turning to look at me. Your carriage awaits, Delaney. Don't call me that, I said, unbuckling my seatbelt and grabbing my leather portfolio. And for the record, this doesn't make us friends. I have no interest in being your friend. The way he said it, low, gravelly, and heavy with intent, sent a jolt straight down my spine. I shoved the passenger door open, stepping out onto the crowded sidewalk. The roar of the hypercar had already drawn a crowd of staring pedestrians and nervous corporate types. I straightened my blazer, refusing to acknowledge the spectacle, and marched toward the revolving glass doors of the lobby. I thought that was it. I thought I had survived the tornado that was Gideon Croft. But as I reached the doors, a frantic valet in a red vest sprinted past me. I paused, looking over my shoulder. Gideon had stepped out of the driver's seat. He didn't get back in. Instead, he casually tossed the keys to the bewildered valet, adjusted his cuffs, and began walking toward the building. Toward me. "What are you doing?" I demanded as he caught up to me, his long strides easily matching my hurried pace. "I'm walking you to your meeting," he stated, stepping smoothly into the revolving door right behind me. "No, you are absolutely not," I hissed, spinning around to face him the second we stepped into the marble lobby. "We had a deal. You brought me here. Now leave." "I agreed to drive you," he corrected, stepping so close I had to crane my neck to maintain eye contact. "I never agreed to leave before I knew you won your little pitch. Lead the way." "You cannot come up there," I whispered furiously, jabbing the up button on the elevator bank like it had personally insulted me. "It is a closed-door meeting with the executive board of the largest urban development firm in the city. You are dressed like a mechanic." Gideon glanced down at his grease-smudged coveralls, completely unbothered. "I own half the steel in this building. I can dress however I please." The elevator chimed, and the brushed steel doors slid open. I stepped inside, silently praying he would reconsider. He didn't. He followed me in, the sheer mass of his shoulders making the spacious executive car feel like a broom closet. "If you ruin this for me," I warned, gripping my portfolio so tightly my knuckles turned white. "If you breathe too loudly, or if you attempt to intimidate anyone in that room, I will personally throw you out of the 30th story window." "I'd like to see you try," he replied, a slow, predatory smile touching his lips. The doors opened to the executive floor. I took a deep breath, compartmentalizing the absolute chaos of the last hour, and marched down the hallway. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main boardroom. 6 executives in bespoke suits turned to stare at me. Then, their eyes shifted to the towering, grease-stained giant lingering casually in the doorway behind me. The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Delaney, Richard, a senior partner with a notoriously fragile ego, sneered from the head of the table. "You're late. And who exactly is this? Did building maintenance get lost?" "He is." I scrambled for a professional lie. "An external consultant. On structural integrity." Gideon didn't correct me. He simply strolled to the back of the room, pulled out a leather chair, and sat down. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The heavy, dominating weight of his presence instantly shifted the gravity of the room. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly hyper-aware of the massive predator sitting in the shadows. "Right," Richard scoffed, clearly unnerved but trying to maintain his authority. "Let's get this over with. Walk us through the waterfront revitalization proposal. Make it quick." I stepped up to the projector, refusing to look at the back of the room. I launched into my pitch. I was flawless. The numbers were bulletproof, the design was innovative, and the structural planning was years ahead of anything the firm had ever produced. I poured every ounce of my ambition into the presentation, completely ignoring the man watching my every move with terrifying focus. When I finished, I clicked off the projector. "That is the future of the district. Are there any questions?" Richard leaned back, steepling his fingers. "It's aggressive, Delaney. Perhaps too aggressive for a junior architect. The board feels this project requires a firmer, more experienced hand. I'll be taking over the lead on the waterfront design." My stomach plummeted. He was stealing my project. It was a blatant, unapologetic theft of my work. I opened my mouth to fight back, to tear his logic apart, but before I could utter a single syllable, a chair scraped against the floor at the back of the room. Gideon stood up. The casual, amused demeanor was entirely gone. He walked slowly toward the front of the table. his heavy footsteps echoing like a countdown. The executives visibly paled. Richard swallowed hard, his smug expression melting into outright panic. "I disagree," Gideon said, stopping right beside me. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer command in his tone made the room feel dangerously cold. "I'm sorry," Richard stammered, trying to puff out his chest. "I don't believe you have a say in this firm's internal structuring." Gideon rested his hands on the polished oak table, leaning forward just enough to make Richard press his back flat against his chair. "My name is Gideon Croft. I am the primary financial backer for the Waterfront Revitalization Grant, and I am telling you, Richard, that if this woman is not credited as the lead architect, I will pull my funding, buy this firm, and liquidate your pension by morning." Complete, suffocating silence gripped the boardroom. Richard looked like he was about to pass out. "She keeps the project," Gideon stated, an absolute decree that left zero room for negotiation. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to me, his amber eyes burning with an intense, possessive heat that wiped my mind completely blank. "Grab your things, Delaney," he ordered softly. "It's time for our date." I didn't look back at Richard's pale, sweat-slicked face or the stunned silence of the executive board. I just grabbed my leather portfolio, turned on my heel, and marched out of the boardroom. I made it exactly 3 steps down the carpeted hallway before I spun around and shoved my finger squarely into the center of Gideon Croft's chest. It was like poking a concrete pillar, but I didn't care. "What is wrong with you?" I hissed, keeping my voice low enough so the receptionists wouldn't hear. "I just secured your promotion, Delaney," he replied calmly, looking down at my finger and then back up to my eyes. He didn't look offended. He looked utterly delighted. "Most people say, thank you." "Thank you?" I threw my hands up in exasperation, storming toward the elevator bank. He kept pace with me, completely unhurried, his heavy boots making no sound on the floor. "I didn't need you to rescue me. I was handling Richard." "You were about to politely argue with a thief who held all the institutional power," Gideon countered, stepping onto the elevator with me. The doors slid shut, sealing us in the mirrored box. "I simply rearranged the power dynamic so your actual talent could dictate the outcome. I leveled the playing field." "By threatening to buy the entire firm?" I yelled, finally letting my composure crack. "You humiliated my boss." "Your boss is a parasite," Gideon stated. His amber eyes darkened, the amusement vanishing, replaced by a sudden, intense sharpness. "He tried to take what is yours. I do not tolerate that. Not in my business, and certainly not with you." The absolute certainty in his voice hit me like a physical blow. "With you." The implication hung in the air, heavy and thick. He barely knew me, yet he was defending my territory with a ruthless, predatory instinct that defied all corporate logic. I stared at him, my chest heaving, completely unable to find a rational counter-argument. "Our date was supposed to be Friday," I finally managed to say, changing the subject as the elevator chimed for the lobby. "It's Thursday afternoon." "I am an impatient man," Gideon said smoothly, the dangerous edge leaving his voice as quickly as it had appeared. The doors opened. "My driver is outside. He will take you to your apartment. You have exactly 2 hours to get ready. Do not make me come upstairs to fetch you." "I can dress myself, Mr. Croft," I snapped, brushing past him. "I'm counting on it," he murmured. The ride to my apartment was entirely silent, the privacy partition rolled up in the sleek black town car he had forced me into. When I finally unlocked my front door, I dropped my keys on the console table and let out a long, exhausted breath. I had won the waterfront project. It was the biggest victory of my career, but it felt entirely hijacked by a towering billionaire who looked at me like I was his next acquisition. I flipped on the lights and froze. Sitting in the exact center of my kitchen island was a massive, matte black garment box. It was tied with a thick silk ribbon. I cautiously approached it, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. There was no note. I pulled the ribbon, lifted the heavy lid, and peeled back layers of crisp tissue paper. Inside lay the most exquisite piece of clothing I had ever seen. It was a midnight blue gown constructed from a silk so heavy and rich it looked like liquid water. I lifted it by the hanger, the fabric pooling over my arms. It was breathtaking. A sharp, asymmetrical cut that was fiercely modern but undeniably elegant. It was the kind of dress a queen would wear to a war council. I stripped off my work clothes and slipped it on, turning toward the full-length mirror in my bedroom. My breath hitched. It fit perfectly. Not just well, perfectly. The bodice gripped my ribs like a second skin, the hem brushing the floor at the exact right length for my favorite heels. I hadn't given him my measurements. I hadn't even told him my last name in that garage. Yet Gideon Croft had somehow procured a bespoke, impossibly expensive gown tailored to my exact dimensions in a matter of hours. It was a violation of my privacy, a blatant display of his overwhelming reach and the most terrifyingly romantic thing anyone had ever done for me. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. An unknown number. I am downstairs. Wear the dress. When I pushed through the glass doors of my apartment building, the black town car was gone. In its place sat the terrifying $3 million hypercar, idling with a low, menacing growl that vibrated through the pavement. Gideon was leaning against the passenger door. He had shed the grease-stained coveralls for a tailored, charcoal gray suit that fit his massive frame with lethal precision. His eyes locked onto me as I walked down the steps. The air between us instantly thickened. He didn't offer a polite compliment. He didn't smile. He just stared at me, his amber gaze dropping to the slit in the silk gown before slowly trailing back up to my face. The sheer intensity of his focus made my skin flush hot. "Get in," he commanded softly, opening the door for me. I didn't argue. I slid into the leather seat, acutely aware of the way his eyes tracked my every movement. 20 minutes later, we arrived at L'Orchidée, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign on the door, let alone a reservation list you could actually call. The maitre d' practically bowed when Gideon walked in, immediately escorting us past tables of minor celebrities and hedge fund managers to a private, glass-enclosed alcove overlooking the city skyline. "You didn't answer my question in the garage," I said, the moment the waiter poured our wine and vanished. I refused to let the opulent surroundings intimidate me. I kept my posture perfectly straight, meeting his gaze across the candle-lit table. "Why are you doing this? You could have any supermodel or socialite in the city. Why kidnap an architect who insulted you?" Gideon took a slow sip of his wine, watching me over the rim of the crystal glass. "Because socialites agree with everything I say before I even finish my sentence. They bore me to tears, Delaney. You, on the other hand, stood in my garage, looked me dead in the eye, and threw heavy metal at my head. So I'm a novelty." I gripped my fork, my frustration flaring. "A shiny, aggressive toy for the billionaire who has everything." "You are not a toy," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all traces of amusement. "If you were a toy, I would have broken you already. You are a challenge. You are the first person in a decade who hasn't looked at my bank account and immediately offered their neck." "I earn my own money, Mr. Croft. I don't need yours." "I know," he murmured, leaning forward, closing the physical distance across the small table. "And it is entirely intoxicating." "I'm not going to be another asset you can manage," I warned him, pointing my knife at him for emphasis. "I don't care how many dresses you buy me or how many boardrooms you crash. I belong to myself." "We will see," he challenged, a slow, wicked smile returning to his lips. The banter continued through 3 courses. I fought him on everything: architecture, politics, the ethics of his corporate monopolies. I refused to yield an inch of intellectual ground, and instead of getting angry, Gideon only seemed to grow more fascinated. He countered my arguments with razor-sharp intelligence matching my fierce energy blow for blow. It was the most exhilarating conversation of my life. As the waiter cleared our dessert plates, I leaned back in my chair, flush with the adrenaline of the verbal sparring. "Admit it, I was right about the zoning laws in the financial district." "You were completely wrong," Gideon replied smoothly. But your absolute refusal to admit defeat is charming. I am not charming, I scoffed, crossing my legs under the table. As I shifted, my knee accidentally brushed against his. It wasn't a spark. It wasn't a standard, cliché flutter of chemistry. The second our skin made contact through the fabric of my gown, an intense, supernatural shockwave of heat violently exploded up my leg. It was so agonizingly hot and sudden that I gasped aloud, my hands slamming flat onto the table as a jolt of pure electricity arched through my entire nervous system. The heat didn't dissipate. It instantly rushed to my chest, stealing the oxygen from my lungs and making my vision blur at the edges. My heart hammered wildly, recognizing a primal, absolute truth my logical brain couldn't process. I looked up, terrified. Gideon had gone completely still. His amber eyes were practically glowing in the dim light, the pupils blown wide. He hadn't pulled his leg away. He leaned over the table, his gaze locked on my panicked face, and I realized with absolute, terrifying certainty that whatever just happened to me, he felt it too. "What?" I whispered, my voice trembling, unable to break his gaze. "What did you just do to me?" I didn't sleep that night. I paced my apartment until 3 a.m, trying to rationalize the impossible, blinding heat that had ripped through my veins at the restaurant. It had to be static electricity, a localized nerve spasm, anything other than the terrifying primal connection that had flared between us in that glass alcove. Gideon had simply escorted me home in heavy silence, his eyes burning with an unspoken promise as he left me at my door. I thought space would help me regain my sanity. I thought wrong. By Tuesday, Gideon Croft hadn't just invaded my thoughts, he had executed a hostile takeover of my entire existence. It started small. On Friday morning, a barista from the ultra-exclusive cafe 3 blocks away walked directly into my firm's bullpen, ignoring the receptionist, and placed a ridiculously complex, perfectly customized espresso order on my desk. It had already been paid for. On Monday, the catering company for my waterfront project was mysteriously replaced by a 5-star Michelin kitchen, completely free of charge. Then came the security. I first noticed the men on Tuesday afternoon. 2 massive, impeccably dressed individuals with earpieces subtly trailing me halfway down the block whenever I left the building for lunch. They didn't approach me. They didn't speak to me. But whenever a delivery cyclist veered too close to the sidewalk, or a stranger lingered too near, the men shifted with a terrifying, synchronized aggression that cleared a 10-foot radius around me. I was being managed, guarded, claimed. My fierce independence was being smothered by his absolute, overwhelming blanket of protection. It was infuriating, claustrophobic, and entirely unacceptable. "Delaney, are you even looking at these blueprints?" Richard snapped, tapping his pen against the conference table. Ever since Gideon's threat, Richard had been forced to act as my subordinate, a fact that made him visibly miserable. I stared at the schematics, but all I could see was the memory of Gideon's glowing amber eyes. I looked out the glass walls of the conference room and spotted the 2 massive security guards loitering in the lobby, effectively terrifying the administrative staff. Something inside me snapped. "The structural load on the East Pier is fine, Richard," I said, standing up so abruptly my chair rolled backward and hit the wall. I grabbed my coat. "I have an errand to run. Do not change the support columns while I am gone." I didn't wait for his response. I marched out of the office, stalked past the 2 giant bodyguards without breaking stride, and hailed a cab. 20 minutes later, I stood at the base of Croft Industries, a towering 60-story monolith of black glass and steel that dominated the downtown skyline. I walked through the revolving doors, my heels clicking furiously against the marble floors. The lobby was swarming with corporate sharks and elite security personnel. I marched straight to the polished obsidian security desk. "I need to see Gideon Croft." The head of security didn't ask for my ID. He didn't ask if I had an appointment. He looked at my face, checked a small screen on his desk, and immediately swallowed hard. "Of course, ma'am. The private elevator is at the end of the hall. He's on the top floor. They were expecting me. He had given them standing orders to let me bypass every layer of corporate defense. That only fueled my rage. I rode the silent, high-speed elevator to the penthouse level, my blood boiling. When the doors slid open, I didn't wait for his executive assistant to announce me. I marched past her sprawling desk, grabbed the handles of the heavy, frosted glass double doors leading to his inner sanctum, and threw them open with all the force I could muster. "Call off your goons," I shouted, storming into the room. I froze. Gideon wasn't alone. He was sitting at the head of a massive granite table, surrounded by 6 imposing men who looked less like a corporate board of directors and more like a specialized military strike team. At my sudden entrance, all 6 men shot to their feet in terrifying unison. But it wasn't their speed that made my breath catch in my throat. It was their eyes. For a split second, before they blinked it away, every single man in the room flashed a vivid, unnatural shade of amber, gold, or piercing silver. The air in the room instantly grew heavy, thick with a dangerous, barely restrained violence. My corporate fury slammed into a wall of raw, primal panic. I took a step back, realizing with sudden clarity that I had just walked into a room full of apex predators. Gideon didn't stand. He remained seated at the head of the table, entirely relaxed. He slowly raised a single hand, and the 6 massive men instantly dropped their gaze to the floor, completely submissive. Gideon smiled, his eyes locking onto mine with terrifying, obsessive focus. "Gentlemen, get out. The architect and I have business to discuss." The 6 men didn't murmur a single word of protest. They didn't gather their files or check their phones. At Gideon's silent command, they simply turned in perfect, terrifying synchronization and filed out of the massive penthouse office. As they passed me, keeping their eyes respectfully fixed on the carpet, the sheer physical size of them made my breath hitch. I was a tall woman, used to holding my own in rooms full of imposing executives, but these men were built like absolute brick walls. When the heavy frosted glass doors clicked shut behind the last man, the suffocating tension in the room instantly evaporated. The primal panic that had seized my chest was replaced by the familiar, scorching heat of my own fury. I blinked, forcefully shaking off the memory of their flashing, unnatural eyes. It was the lighting. It had to be the tinted glass of the penthouse windows reflecting the afternoon sun. I was an architect. I understood how light could distort a space. I refused to entertain any other explanation. I marched toward the center of the room, my heels sinking into the plush, ridiculously expensive rug. Gideon remained in his heavy leather chair at the head of the granite conference table. He was wearing another flawlessly tailored suit, his jacket unbuttoned, projecting an aura of complete, unbothered authority. "I don't know what kind of mafia-style intimidation tactics you are running in this building, Mr. Croft," I started, slamming my purse down onto the polished granite. "But you are going to call off your goons. Right now." "They aren't goons, Delaney," Gideon said, his voice a low, soothing rumble that completely contradicted my screaming adrenaline. "They are highly trained security personnel, and they are there for your protection." Protection from what? I threw my hands in the air, gesturing wildly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Delivery drivers? Aggressive pigeons? I live in a secure building and I work in a corporate office. The most dangerous thing in my life right now is you. A slow, devastating smile spread across his face. "I'm glad you recognize that." "This isn't a joke," I snapped, planting my hands on my hips. "You replaced my firm's catering. You're buying my coffee. You have literal giants following me down the sidewalk. You are suffocating me. I am a perfectly capable, independent woman, and I do not need a billionaire treating my life like a hostile corporate acquisition." Gideon finally stood up. He didn't rush, but his movements possessed that same lethal, fluid grace I had witnessed in the garage. He walked slowly around the edge of the granite table, his amber eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I am not trying to acquire you," he murmured, his heavy footsteps making no sound on the rug. "If I wanted to buy your compliance, I would have done it already. I am simply ensuring that what belongs to me remains untouched by anyone else. "I do not belong to you," I fired back, though my voice wavered as he closed the distance between us. I stood my ground, refusing to retreat even as his massive frame blotted out the sunlight streaming through the windows. We went on one date, a date you blackmailed me into. And yet, you are here, he pointed out quietly. He stopped less than a foot away. The clean, intoxicating scent of cedar and expensive musk washed over me, scrambling my thoughts. He was so close I could see the faint pulse beating at the base of his throat. "I'm here to tell you to back off," I insisted, tilting my head back to maintain eye contact. "I will not be managed." "I don't want to manage you, little architect," he said, reaching up slowly. I completely froze as his knuckles grazed the line of my jaw, sending a violent, familiar spike of electricity straight down my spine. "I want to ruin every defense you have until you admit you want me just as badly as I want you." I opened my mouth to deliver a scathing rebuttal, to tell him he was arrogant and delusional, but my body betrayed me. A heavy, involuntary gasp slipped past my lips as his thumb brushed over my lower lip. "You're shaking," he whispered, stepping entirely into my space, trapping me between the heavy granite table and his solid, immovable chest. I couldn't move. The edge of the granite table pressed sharply into my lower back, leaving me completely caged by his towering frame. Everywhere our clothes brushed, that impossible scorching heat flared, sinking directly into my bones. My fiercely guarded logic was screaming at me to push him away, to march out of this penthouse and never look back. But my hands didn't push. Instead, they moved entirely on their own, resting flat against the crisp fabric of his suit jacket. I could feel the steady, heavy thud of his heart beneath my palms. It was beating just as fast as mine. "I'm not shaking," I lied, though my voice came out as a breathless, ragged whisper. "You are a terrible liar," Gideon murmured. He lowered his head, his face hovering mere inches from mine. His amber eyes were dark, dilated, and entirely consumed by hunger. "Your pulse is racing. Your pupils are blown wide. You can fight me in the boardroom all you want, Delaney. But right now, your body is telling me the absolute truth." "You're arrogant," I managed to say, my fingers gripping the lapels of his jacket to steady myself. The room felt like it was spinning, the oxygen completely replaced by his overwhelming presence. "I am honest," he corrected. His large hands moved to my waist, gripping me with a firm, possessive hold that sent a jolt of pure fire straight to my core. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing the shell of my ear. "Tell me to let you go. Say the words and I will step back, I will pull the security, I will cancel the coffee, and you will never see me again." My breath hitched. The thought of him vanishing, of returning to my quiet, highly structured, perfectly safe life, suddenly felt like a death sentence. The infuriating, terrifying chaos he brought with him was the most alive I had ever felt. I didn't say the words. I couldn't. Gideon let out a low, victorious groan that vibrated against my chest. He shifted his grip, sliding one hand to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling deeply into my hair. He tilted my head back, exposing my throat, and I felt my eyes flutter shut in total, terrifying surrender. I braced myself for the kiss. I wanted it. I wanted the collision of his mouth against mine more than I had ever wanted a promotion or a partnership. His lips brushed against mine, a agonizingly slow, deliberate friction that made my knees completely buckle. I gripped his jacket tighter, pulling him down, chasing the contact. But he didn't close the gap. Right as I parted my lips, completely yielding to the overwhelming gravity between us, Gideon abruptly stopped. He pulled his face back just enough to break the spell, his chest heaving with heavy, restrained breaths. My eyes flew open in shock and deep, agonizing frustration. "What are you doing?" "I am proving a point," he said roughly, his amber eyes blazing with an unholy amount of restraint. He was fighting his own instincts just as hard as I was. "If I kiss you right now, here in this office, you will spend the rest of the week trying to convince yourself it was a mistake. You will build your corporate walls right back up. I am not. Pack a bag, he interrupted, his voice returning to that absolute commanding baritone. He slowly released my waist, though he didn't step back. The loss of his heat left me shivering. I am picking you up tomorrow at noon. You are coming to my coastal estate for the weekend. I stared at him, my mind struggling to catch up with the sudden shift in dynamics. I didn't agree to a weekend away. I have a firm to run. Your firm is closed for a structural audit on Friday. I made sure of it, he stated smoothly, reaching out to adjust the collar of my blazer with maddening calmness. I want you in my territory, Delaney, where there are no boardrooms to hide behind. Just you and me, finishing this conversation. Gideon didn't drive us to the estate. He flew us. The private helicopter bypassed the grueling Friday afternoon traffic entirely, sweeping over the sprawling metropolis and heading directly toward the rugged, isolated coastline. By the time we touched down on a manicured helipad set against a dramatic ocean cliff, my nerves were completely frayed. The estate was a masterpiece of modern architecture. It was a sprawling, multi-level fortress of black stone, reinforced glass, and dark wood that seamlessly integrated into the jagged cliffside. For a brief second, the sheer brilliance of the structural design distracted me from the terrifying reality that I was completely isolated with the most intense man I had ever met. But the architecture wasn't the strangest thing about the estate. It was the staff. As we walked through the towering glass doors, a team of housekeepers and groundsmen stood waiting in the massive foyer. They didn't just greet Gideon, they practically yielded to him. There was an unspoken, hyper-vigilant deference in the way they moved. They kept their voices hushed, their eyes slightly averted, radiating a level of intense, instinctual respect that went far beyond typical billionaire staff dynamics. It felt distinctly like a pack submitting to its leader. They act like they're terrified of you, I noted quietly, watching a housekeeper scurry away after taking my overnight bag. They aren't terrified, Gideon replied, pouring a measure of amber liquid from a crystal decanter on the living room bar. He offered me the glass. They are respectful of the hierarchy, and they are highly curious about you. Why? I asked, accepting the drink. Our fingers brushed, and I forced myself not to react to the inevitable spark of heat. Because I have never brought anyone here, he said simply. He walked over to the sprawling wall of windows overlooking the dark, churning ocean. He didn't elaborate, leaving the heavy weight of that confession hanging in the air between us. Dinner was an intimate, agonizingly tense affair. Gideon didn't push me. He didn't try to touch me or pick up where we left off in his office. He simply watched me with that steady, predatory patience, asking sharp, intelligent questions about my life before architecture. By the time he escorted me to my guest suite, the mental exhaustion of maintaining my guard had taken its toll. But sleep refused to come. At 2 a.m, I gave up trying. I threw off the heavy silk duvet, wrapped myself in a thick robe, and slid the glass balcony door open. The salty ocean breeze was freezing, but the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs was the only thing capable of soothing my racing mind. I leaned against the heavy glass railing, looking down at the sprawling moonlit lawns that stretched toward the perimeter wall. Suddenly, a shadow moved. My breath caught. Someone was sprinting across the manicured grass. It wasn't a member of the staff. They were moving too fast, entirely too frantic. In the dim moonlight, the trespasser looked massive, charging directly toward the main house with an aggressive, reckless momentum. Before I could turn to hit the security intercom in my room, the glass doors directly below my balcony slid open. Gideon stepped out onto the terrace. He wasn't wearing a shirt, just a pair of dark sweatpants. He didn't shout or call for his security team. He simply tracked the trespasser's movement with terrifying calmness. The trespasser vaulted over a stone fountain, clearly intent on rushing the terrace. What happened next defied every law of physics I had ever studied. Gideon moved. He didn't run. He blurred. In a fraction of a second, he crossed the sprawling stone terrace and launched himself into the air. Without a running start, he effortlessly cleared the 12-foot retaining wall that separated the terrace from the lawn. He landed soundlessly in front of the charging trespasser, the earth seeming to absorb his massive impact. He grabbed the man by the collar of his jacket with one hand, effortlessly lifting the massive intruder 2 feet off the ground as if he weighed nothing more than a child. I gripped the cold glass railing, my heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't possible. The speed, the inhuman strength, the absolute apex predator dominance. My logical, highly educated brain short-circuited entirely as I stared down at the man who had completely hijacked my life. Gideon didn't strike the man. He simply turned his head, looking straight up at my balcony. Even in the dark, from 3 stories up, I could perfectly see his eyes glowing with a brilliant, undeniable, inhuman amber light. I stumbled backward from the cold glass of the balcony, my pulse hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm in my ears. The logical foundation of my entire world was cracking beneath my bare feet. A man did not leap a 12-foot stone wall from a standstill. A man did not lift a 200-pound intruder by the collar with a single hand. And a man certainly did not have eyes that glowed in the dark like a predator hunting in the brush. I didn't cower in my bedroom. Cowering was for prey, and I had spent my entire adult life clawing my way to the top of a brutal corporate ladder specifically so I would never be the victim in any room. I tied my robe tightly around my waist, shoved my feet into my slippers, and marched out of the guest suite. I found him in the sprawling 2-story library on the main floor. The room was dark, illuminated only by the dying embers of a massive stone fireplace. Gideon was pouring a glass of scotch at a side table, still shirtless, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just casually broken every known law of physics on his front lawn. "Who did you call?" I demanded, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. "The police? Building security?" "I had my men escort him off the perimeter," Gideon replied without turning around. His voice was smooth, perfectly calm. "He was a scout from a neighboring territory, testing my borders. He won't be back." "A territory." I repeated the word, stepping further into the dim room. "You don't run a corporation, do you? You run a cartel, that's what this is. You're some kind of high-tech real estate mafia." Gideon finally turned. The amber glow in his eyes had faded back to their normal, piercing shade, but the sheer physical presence of him, the broad expanse of his chest, the heavy muscle, the perfect, terrifying stillness, was enough to make my breath catch all over again. "I run a pack, Delaney," he stated simply, taking a sip of his scotch. He didn't try to soften the delivery. He didn't offer a gentle preamble. "My family has controlled this region for 6 centuries. We integrated into the human financial sector 90 years ago because buying steel and glass is significantly more efficient than fighting over forests. But the hierarchy remains the exact same." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the arrogant smirk. But his expression was deadly serious. "You're insane." "You saw me jump that wall?" he countered, setting his glass down and slowly closing the distance between us. He didn't run hot. He didn't radiate some mystical energy. He was just overwhelmingly, fundamentally different. You saw my eyes. You felt the shockwave when our skin brushed at the restaurant. Your highly educated, fiercely logical brain is trying to find an architectural flaw in a structure that is entirely sound. I am exactly what you think I am. "A wolf," I whispered, the absurdity of the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "An alpha king, if you want to be precise about titles," he corrected, stopping barely a foot away. "Though I prefer CEO on paper, it causes fewer issues with the SEC. This is a prank." I shook my head, crossing my arms tightly over my chest as a defensive barrier. "This is some elaborate billionaire psychological game because I insulted you in a parking garage." Gideon let out a low, rumbling sigh. He reached out, moving so fast my eyes could barely track the motion, and gently gripped my forearms, pulling my crossed arms down. "I don't play games with my own biology, and I certainly don't play games with yours." "What does my biology have to do with this?" I snapped, trying to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. He stepped directly into my space. He lowered his head, his nose brushing the curve of my jaw as he deliberately, agonizingly breathed in the scent of my skin. My entire body betrayed me, arching slightly into the contact. "Everything," Gideon murmured, his lips grazing my earlobe. "Because I knew you were my mate the exact second you threw those car keys directly at my chest." The word dropped into the quiet library like a live grenade. Mate. It wasn't a corporate title. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was a biological absolute, a genetic decree that stripped away every ounce of autonomy I had ever fought for. I shoved my hands against his bare chest, pushing him away with every fraction of strength I possessed. He let me go instantly, his hands raising in a gesture of surrender, though his amber eyes remained locked onto mine with a terrifying, possessive intensity. "No," I said, my voice trembling with a potent mixture of raw fear and explosive anger. "Absolutely not. I am not a piece of real estate you can acquire, and I am certainly not a biological inevitability. I am Delaney. I am a senior architect. I dictate my own future." "You cannot design your way out of a genetic bond," Gideon said calmly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. The absolute unwavering certainty in his posture only fueled my panic. "Your body already knows. That heat you feel when I look at you, the fact that you marched into my penthouse instead of calling the police, you belong to me, Delaney, just as completely as I belong to you." "I don't belong to anyone," I yelled, the sound echoing off the high, vaulted ceiling of the library. "I spent my entire life fighting men who think they can tell me where I fit in their grand designs. I refuse to be a footnote in your modern mythology. I am leaving." I spun on my heel, my slippers sliding against the polished hardwood floor, and marched toward the sweeping staircase. I fully expected him to stop me. I expected him to use that impossible speed to block the door, or to issue an alpha command that would freeze me in my tracks. I braced myself for the fight of my life. It never came. "My driver is awake," Gideon called out from the center of the library. I froze on the first step, whipping my head around to look at him. He hadn't moved an inch. He picked up his scotch, his expression entirely unreadable. "He will have the town car brought to the front doors in 10 minutes. Take all the time you need to pack." You're letting me go?" My voice betrayed my absolute shock. "I have never forced anyone to stay in my territory, and I am not going to start with my queen," he replied. He took a slow sip of his drink, his amber gaze burning straight through my defenses. "You need to walk away so you can realize the truth for yourself. Your logic requires a stress test." "I am never coming back here," I promised, my voice hardening. "We will see," he murmured. 15 minutes later, I walked out the massive glass doors of the estate. True to his word, the sleek black town car was idling on the circular driveway. The driver opened the rear door for me without a word. I didn't see the security team. I didn't see the terrified staff. And I didn't see Gideon. I slid into the back seat, the heavy door thudding shut behind me. As the car began to roll down the long, winding driveway toward the main gates, a sudden, agonizing pain bloomed right in the center of my chest. It wasn't magical. It was the absolute, crushing emotional gravity of leaving him behind. Every mile the car put between us felt like a physical tether snapping tight, threatening to drag me backward. I forced myself not to look out the rear window. I stared straight ahead, clinging to the familiar, structured reality of my human life. But as the iron gates of the estate opened to let me out into the cold, dark night, I caught a glimpse of the highest balcony in the rear-view mirror. A lone, massive silhouette stood in the shadows, perfectly still, watching me drive away into the dark. By Wednesday morning, my structured, logical world had officially been restored to its former glory. I sat at the head of the polished oak table in the primary conference room of the firm. Spread out before me were the finalized blueprints for the waterfront revitalization project. "The board has formally approved the structural budget," Richard said, sliding a thick manila folder across the table toward me. He looked physically pained to be speaking the words. "Congratulations, Delaney. You are officially the lead architect on this firm's most lucrative account. The corner office on the 22nd floor is yours by the end of the day." This was it. The culmination of 7 years of 80-hour work weeks, missed holidays, and relentless corporate maneuvering. I had outsmarted my rivals, secured the funding, and completely neutered Richard's ability to steal my credit. It was the ultimate professional victory. I looked down at the folder. Thank you, Richard. Ensure the engineering team has the updated load-bearing specs by noon. I dismissed the room with a wave of my hand. The junior executives filed out quickly, leaving me completely alone in the sprawling glass conference room. I picked up my favorite drafting pen, spinning it between my fingers. I looked out the window at the bustling city skyline, waiting for the familiar rush of adrenaline and pride to wash over me. Nothing happened. The victory felt like chewing on dry cardboard. My brilliant, highly coveted corner office felt like a sterile, lifeless box. Every passing hour since I had driven away from the coastal estate felt entirely hollow. I was sleeping poorly, my food had no taste, and my fiercely independent spirit felt less like a shield and more like a self-imposed solitary confinement. My body was in a constant state of agonizing withdrawal. I kept waiting for Gideon to crash through the double doors. I kept expecting to look down at the street and see his terrifyingly expensive hypercar parked illegally on the curb. But he had kept his word. He hadn't called. He hadn't sent his security team. He had completely, utterly vanished from my life, leaving me exactly what I had demanded, my independence. I hated it. Delivery for you, Delaney. I blinked, snapping out of my trance as my assistant, a bright-eyed intern, hovered nervously in the doorway. She wasn't holding a stack of blueprints. She was holding a single thick envelope. It wasn't standard office mail, it was crafted from heavy midnight blue cardstock, the exact same shade as the bespoke gown currently hanging in my closet. My pulse instantly skyrocketed. I snatched the envelope from her hands so fast she flinched. Thank you. Close the door. Once I was alone, I flipped the envelope over. It was sealed with a heavy dollop of dark red wax, stamped with a complex, ancient-looking crest. I broke the seal with my thumb, my hands trembling as I pulled out the heavy, embossed invitation. The Decennial Pack Gala. An evening to honor the alliances of the region, hosted by Gideon Croft. A piece of heavy vellum paper fluttered out from behind the invitation and landed softly on the blueprints. There was no formal heading, no signature. Just 3 words written in sharp, aggressive black ink. Prove me wrong. He was challenging my logic. He was betting his entire empire that I couldn't stay away, that my human ambition couldn't compete with the bond between us. He was daring me to walk into a room full of apex predators and look him in the eye. I stared at the challenge for a long, heavy minute. Then, I slowly pushed my chair back, abandoning the biggest architectural project of my life on the table, and reached for my coat. I didn't go home to pack a bag. I didn't return to the penthouse to fetch the exquisite, custom-tailored midnight blue gown Gideon had bought for me. Wearing his dress would have been a concession, a silent admission that I was arriving as his property, styled and curated for his pack's approval. If I was going to walk into a den of apex predators, I was going to do it in my own armor. I spent a frankly irresponsible amount of my newly acquired senior partner bonus at a high-end boutique downtown. The dress I chose was a striking structural masterpiece in a deep blood-red hue. It had a razor-sharp asymmetrical neckline and a severe slit that required absolute confidence to pull off. It was less of a gown and more of a declaration of war. By the time my taxi pulled up to the sprawling, historic Astor Heritage Estate at the edge of the city limits, my adrenaline was entirely masking my terror. The venue was illuminated by hundreds of floating lanterns and flanked by rows of ridiculously expensive luxury vehicles. I stepped out of the cab, the cool night air biting at my exposed shoulders, and walked up the grand stone steps. 2 massive men in tailored tuxedos guarded the heavy brass doors. They didn't look like bouncers. They had that same lethal, hyper-vigilant stillness as the men in Gideon's penthouse. I handed the man on the right my midnight blue invitation. He took it, glancing at the wax seal before his eyes snapped up to my face. His nostrils flared slightly. I saw the exact moment he realized I had no scent of the forest, no underlying hum of supernatural power. I was entirely, fundamentally human. A flicker of raw confusion crossed his face, but the seal of the Alpha King was absolute. He stepped aside, bowing his head slightly, and pulled the heavy door open. "Welcome, Ms. Delaney." I stepped over the threshold and into another world. The ballroom was a breathtaking cavern of gilded arches, crystal chandeliers, and cascading white floral arrangements. But the architecture was completely overshadowed by the people. They were impossibly beautiful, draped in haute couture and glittering jewels, moving with a fluid, liquid grace that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders, and descended the grand staircase. It started as a ripple. A woman in an emerald gown near the bottom of the stairs paused mid-laugh, her head snapping in my direction. Then the man beside her turned. Like dominoes falling, the conversation in the immediate vicinity began to die out, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. They could smell me. They knew exactly what I lacked. I ignored the sudden weight of 100 predatory stares and kept my eyes fixed forward, scanning the massive room. I found him instantly. Gideon was standing on a raised dais at the far end of the ballroom, surrounded by an inner circle of elite, severe-looking men and women. He was wearing a stark black tuxedo that made him look completely devastating. He was in the middle of speaking to a distinguished-looking man when he suddenly stopped. His head whipped toward the staircase. Across a sea of mythological high society, his amber eyes locked onto mine. The physical impact of his gaze hit me so hard, I actually felt my lungs seize. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath, following his line of sight directly to the lone human woman in the blood-red dress standing on their staircase. The air pressure in the room visibly shifted, thick with his sudden, overwhelming focus. He didn't smile. A dark, possessive fire flared in his eyes, so intense it silenced the remaining chatter in the room. He took a single step toward the edge of the dais, his jaw tightening as his gaze slowly dragged down the length of my crimson gown. For a breathless second, I thought Gideon was going to vault over the velvet ropes of the dais and cross the ballroom floor. The feral, unblinking intensity in his posture suggested he was entirely capable of it. But before his boot could touch the lower step, the distinguished, silver-haired man he had been speaking to stepped firmly into his path, placing a hand on Gideon's arm and whispering urgently into his ear. Gideon's jaw clenched tight enough to snap bone. He didn't look away from me, but he stopped his descent, trapped by whatever ancient political protocol the silver-haired man was enforcing. I wasn't going to stand on the stairs like a lost, waiting puppy. I lifted my chin, broke eye contact with the Alpha King, and glided down the remaining steps with all the haughty grace I had perfected in corporate boardrooms. I made a beeline for the massive ice-sculpted bar at the edge of the room. The crowd parted for me, though they didn't do it out of respect. They did it the way people step back from an unpredictable animal at the zoo. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, hear the sharp, hushed whispers analyzing my complete lack of pedigree. "Gin and tonic," I ordered, my voice perfectly steady as the bartender handed me a crystal glass. I took a sip, the ice-cold liquid helping to ground my racing heart. I had proven my point. I had walked into his territory entirely on my own terms. Now, I just had to survive the cocktail hour. "Well, isn't this a curious little anomaly?" The voice was soft, laced with a terrifyingly sweet venom. I turned slowly, gripping my glass. 3 people had approached me, completely slipping past my radar. 2 older women draped in heavy diamond necklaces and a man leaning heavily on an ornate silver cane. They radiated an ancient, suffocating arrogance. They didn't look at me like I was an anomaly. They looked at me like I was an infestation. "Can I help you?" I asked politely, slipping instantly into my professional, client-facing persona. "I am Beatrice," the woman in the center said, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "And we are the High Council of this territory. We were just debating how a fragile, scentless little human managed to bypass security. Did you wander away from the catering staff, dear?" My grip tightened on the crystal glass, but my expression remained completely passive. "I received an invitation directly from the host, though if the security here is typically so lax, I can recommend a few private firms to audit your perimeter." The man with the cane let out a dry, mocking chuckle. "She has a sharp tongue. How amusing. I suppose Gideon has always harbored a peculiar fascination with fleeting, delicate things. A new pet for the season, perhaps?" "It won't last until winter," the second woman sneered, stepping closer, deliberately invading my personal space to let her dominant presence crash over me. "He is the Alpha King. His bloodline requires strength, power, and ancient lineage. Not a soft, breakable corporate drone who will wither the second-pack politics become difficult. You are a temporary distraction, little girl. You do not belong in this room." The insult hung in the air, heavy and designed to break me. I saw the smug satisfaction in their eyes, the absolute certainty that I would lower my head, burst into tears, and flee the gala in disgrace. Instead, a profound, chilling calmness washed over me. I looked at these ancient, arrogant beings, and I didn't see apex predators anymore. I saw a boardroom full of hostile, outdated shareholders trying to intimidate a new partner. And I absolutely decimated hostile shareholders for a living. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my gin, letting the silence stretch, and then smiled my absolute sharpest, most ruthless corporate smile. "A temporary distraction," I repeated, swirling the ice in my glass. I looked at Beatrice, dropping all pretense of polite society. "That's a fascinating assessment from a council that currently relies entirely on Gideon's human currency to maintain its power." Beatrice's smug smile faltered, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said, my voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of the surrounding elite. "You're standing here lecturing me about ancient lineage and bloodlines while drinking champagne paid for by Croft Industries, an industry built, managed, and expanded in the human sector. The world has moved on, Beatrice. Your forest hierarchy doesn't pay the property taxes on this estate. I do." The man with the cane slammed the silver tip against the marble floor, his eyes flashing a vivid, furious yellow. "You dare speak to a high elder with such insolence? You are nothing but human frailty. You will lower your eyes when addressing your betters." "I don't lower my eyes for middle management," I fired back instantly, the words leaving my mouth before I could filter them. The effect was catastrophic. Someone behind me actually dropped their glass. It shattered against the marble floor with a piercing crash, but nobody moved to clean it up. The string quartet in the corner screeched to a halt, abandoning their instruments mid-note. The entire ballroom plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. I didn't know the exact laws of pack etiquette, but the sheer, suffocating terror radiating from the crowd told me I had just committed an unforgivable faux pas. Telling a high elder they were the equivalent of expendable corporate middle management wasn't just an insult. It was a direct challenge to their fundamental authority. Beatrice's face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. Her jaw shifted, a low, guttural snarl vibrating in her throat that sounded distinctly inhuman. The man raised his cane, his posture aggressively shifting forward as if preparing to physically strike me down for my insubordination. I didn't flinch. I locked my knees, raised my chin, and prepared to take whatever came next without breaking eye contact. "Enough!" The word wasn't shouted. It was spoken quietly, but it carried a concussive force that physically vibrated through the floorboards. The crowd parted violently, people scrambling backward to clear a wide path. Gideon strode down the center of the ballroom. The polite, charming billionaire I had sparred with over dinner was entirely gone. In his place was the Alpha King, radiating a dark, suffocating wave of power that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. He didn't look at the furious elders. His gaze was locked entirely on me. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying stone. I couldn't read his eyes. For the first time since I walked into the garage, I felt a genuine spike of fear. I had humiliated his highest-ranking officials in public. I had openly mocked the foundation of his entire society in front of his subjects. By all logic, he had to banish me to maintain his authority. Gideon stopped directly in front of me, his massive chest rising and falling with heavy, measured breaths. The silence in the room was so profound I could hear the erratic hammering of my own heart. He looked down at me, and I braced myself for the rejection. Beatrice's voice shattered the heavy, suspended silence, shrill and dripping with ancient entitlement. Alpha! This fragile, scentless creature just equated the High Council to corporate middle management. She has openly mocked the bloodline. She must be made an example of. Gideon didn't look at Beatrice. He didn't even acknowledge the furious elder leaning heavily on his silver cane. His entire universe was localized entirely on me, standing my ground in my blood-red armor. I held my breath, lifting my chin a fraction of an inch higher. I wouldn't apologize. If he was going to throw me out, I was going to walk out with my pride completely intact. The corner of Gideon's mouth twitched. Then, his chest began to rumble. It started as a low, dark sound vibrating in his throat before spilling over into a rich, booming laugh that echoed off the gilded ceiling of the ballroom. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was the unrestrained, triumphant laughter of a man who had just won the most spectacular gamble of his life. The collective shock in the room intensified. The elders recoiled, their furious expressions melting into profound, utter confusion. An example, Gideon repeated, his laughter fading into a lethal, razor-sharp smile as he finally turned his head to look at the council. Yes, Beatrice. Let's make an example. He closed the final inch between us. Without asking for permission, his large hand swept around to the small of my back, his long fingers pressing firmly against the bare skin exposed by the cut of my dress. He didn't pull me behind him like a damsel needing protection. He pulled me flush against his side, presenting me to the room as an absolute equal. You wanted a queen with teeth. Gideon addressed the dead-silent ballroom, his baritone voice effortlessly commanding the massive space. You wanted a mate who wouldn't wither under the pressure of pack politics. Well, here she is. She didn't cower when you tried to humiliate her. She didn't wait for my permission to defend herself. She looked the High Council in the eye and ruthlessly audited their authority. He looked down at me, the dark, possessive fire in his amber eyes burning hotter than ever. She has more fire, more sheer, unapologetic spine than anyone in this room. She is human. The man with the cane sputtered, his face flushed with indignity. She carries no scent. She possesses no power. She possesses my power, Gideon decreed, the dangerous predatory edge returning to his voice in a flash. He swept his gaze over the elite crowd, daring a single person to challenge him. Her name is Delaney. She is my mate, and she is the only woman in this world fit to stand beside me. If anyone in this room, on this council, or in this territory ever speaks to her with disrespect again, I will not ask for an apology. I will personally dismantle your wealth, your lineage, and your standing until there is nothing left but dust. The threat wasn't delivered with a shout. It was delivered with the absolute chilling certainty of a billionaire king who held the deeds to every single thing they owned. Beatrice swallowed hard, taking a distinct step backward. The elder with the cane lowered his gaze, his knuckles white as he gripped the silver handle. The rebellion was crushed before it even began. Gideon didn't wait for their submission. He turned his attention back to me. The dangerous mask melted away, leaving only that deep, intoxicating hunger. You came, he whispered, for my ears only. You challenged me. I whispered back, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I don't lose. Neither do I. He didn't ask if I was ready to leave. He simply adjusted his grip on my waist and guided me forward. The sea of mythical high society violently parted, clearing a wide path to the grand double doors. Nobody whispered. Nobody dared to even look at me with anything less than absolute awe. We walked out into the cool night air, leaving the stifling hierarchy of the Astor Heritage Estate behind us. His black hypercar was idling at the base of the stone steps, the valet practically shaking as he handed Gideon the keys. Gideon opened the passenger door. I slid into the ridiculously low leather bucket seat. the adrenaline of the public confrontation finally beginning to crash, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating wave of anticipation. He got in the driver's seat, the door gliding shut and sealing us in the intimate, soundproof cabin. He didn't start the engine right away. He just gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles straining against the leather as he turned his head slowly to look at me. The polite restraint he had shown all week was completely, terrifyingly gone. "I gave you your space," he murmured, his voice rough and dark in the shadows of the car. "I played by your corporate rules, but we are entirely off the clock now, Delaney." He reached across the center console, his hand sliding into my hair. "Tell me exactly where we are going." "Take me to the estate," I said, the words slipping out with an absolute, terrifying certainty. I didn't mean my quiet, lonely apartment in the city. I meant the sprawling, isolated fortress on the cliffs. Gideon's jaw tightened. He didn't ask for clarification. He threw the sleek hypercar into gear, and the engine roared to life with a concussive blast that rattled my bones. We tore through the city limits and hit the dark, winding coastal highway. The drive was a silent blur of black asphalt and silver moonlight. I didn't look at the speedometer. I just watched the rigid, barely leashed tension in Gideon's profile. He drove with that same apex predator focus, but the manicured restraint he had exercised all week was completely shattered. He was racing back to his territory because the final barrier between us had just fallen. Instead of pulling up to the main glass doors of the sprawling house, he veered down a secondary paved driveway, stopping in front of a massive, detached structure built into the cliff face. His private sanctuary. The heavy steel bay doors rolled open automatically, and he parked the hypercar in the center of the surgical-grade lighting. Over in the corner, looking entirely out of place among the multi-million-dollar machines, sat my broken-down vintage coupe. He had towed it here. Gideon killed the engine. The silence in the cabin was instantaneous and heavy. He turned his head to look at me, his broad chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. "We are back exactly where we started," he murmured, his voice dark and gravelly in the enclosed space. "Not quite," I replied. I unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed my door open, stepping out into the pristine, brightly lit space. My heels clicked against the polished concrete, echoing the exact rhythm of my panic from last week. But I wasn't panicking now. Gideon stepped out and walked around the hood of the car, stopping a few feet away. He was giving me the floor, waiting for my terms. "I spent my entire adult life building walls," I started, turning to fully face him. "I designed every aspect of my career and my personal life to be impenetrable, because relying on anyone else was a structural liability. I thought if I yielded an inch of control to a man like you, I would lose everything I ever built." Gideon remained perfectly still, hanging on to my every word. "But you didn't ask me to yield," I continued, closing the distance between us. "You just stood next to me. You matched my ambition. You handed me the power to destroy your own elite council just to prove a point." I stopped right in front of him, looking up into his piercing amber eyes. "I don't want to fight you anymore, Gideon." A raw, guttural sound escaped his throat. He reached out, his massive hands wrapping around my waist, and hoisted me up effortlessly. I gasped as he set me down on the edge of the gleaming titanium workbench. He stepped between my knees, caging me in. "You never have to fight me, Delaney. You only have to let me in." "I'm letting you in," I whispered, tangling my fingers into the lapels of his stark black tuxedo. His mouth crashed down on mine, and the world completely tilted on its axis. There was no hesitation, no gentle preamble. It was a collision of pure, unadulterated need. His lips were demanding, possessing mine with a desperate urgency that completely short-circuited my logical brain. I kissed him back just as fiercely, pulling him closer, anchoring myself to the solid, immovable strength of his chest. His hands swept down my back, mapping the curve of my spine, holding me flush against him as if he were trying to anchor my soul to his. The clean scent of cedar and crisp rain enveloped me, wiping out every lingering trace of corporate stress and human anxiety. I wasn't an architect fighting for her life in a boardroom. I was entirely his, and he was entirely mine. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other. Gideon's hands were still tangled in my hair. "You're not leaving," he whispered, a deliberate, victorious echo of the very first words he ever spoke to me. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. "I'm not leaving." 3 weeks later, I stood in the exact same garage, holding a clipboard loaded with finalized blueprints for the waterfront project. I was officially a senior partner, running the largest architectural account in the city with absolute authority. I tapped my drafting pen against the rusted metal frame of my vintage coupe. A pair of grease-stained coveralls extended from beneath the chassis. "Are you going to fix it or not, Mr. Croft?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Gideon slid out from under the car on a mechanic's creeper. There was a smudge of black grease across his sculpted jaw. He looked up at me, his amber eyes dancing with that familiar, predatory amusement. "I'm getting to it, little architect," he rumbled, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "But my hourly rate just went up." I laughed, tossing a crumpled $50 bill directly at his chest.
Wow, what a ride. Now, unlike Gideon Croft, I am not a billionaire alpha king with a garage full of $3 million hypercars. So if you want to toss a crumpled $50 bill directly at my chest, or, just buy me a coffee, I would massively appreciate it. Bringing these fierce heroines and obsessive alphas to life takes a ton of time, love, and late-night editing. If you genuinely enjoyed Delaney and Gideon's story and want to help fuel the channel so I can keep producing these audiobooks, please consider treating me to a coffee using the seller link down in the pinned comment or the video description. Whether you click that link or just leave a like and a comment, your support means the absolute world to me and keeps this library growing. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for joining the best pack on YouTube, and I'll see you in the next one.